The sound of tires crunching on the gravel echoed through the quiet evening streets of Raleigh, North Carolina. It was a warm spring night, and James Carter, a 45-year-old man with a calm demeanor and a reputation for leadership, was making his way home after a long day. He had just finished a meeting with local community leaders, working to address critical issues in the city. As his car, a modest black sedan, glided down the suburban streets, his thoughts drifted to his wife's famous homemade lasagna waiting for him at home. But suddenly the peace of the night was shattered by the flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. The siren blared through the air, slicing through the calm like an alarm bell. James' grip tightened on the steering wheel. He checked his speedometer. 29 in a 35-minute zone, no broken taillights, no swerving. There was no reason for a traffic stop. Yet the patrol car's flashing lights demanded he pull over. "Stay calm," he muttered under his breath, signaling and pulling over to the side of the road. It was a routine he had gone through countless times before, but this time felt different. He knew how to handle these situations. Slow, deliberate movements, hands visible, polite and calm. It wasn't that he had ever done anything wrong, but because he knew that how you appeared in these moments could mean everything. As the officer approached his window, James noticed the officer's flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, sweeping over the interior of the car. A second officer lingered near the back of the vehicle, hand resting on his holstered weapon. The first officer's voice was brisk and full of suspicion. "You in a hurry tonight?" he asked. "No, sir," James replied calmly, his voice steady but firm. "Just heading home." The officer's flashlight flicked over his face, pausing just a second too long before scanning the rest of the car. He asked for James's license and registration in an almost mechanical tone, ignoring his answer. James reached slowly for his glove compartment, narrating his movements aloud. "I'm getting my registration now. My license is in my wallet. I'll reach for it after this." But the officer didn't respond. His stance was rigid, the tension rising in the air. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" the officer asked, his question almost rhetorical. Before James could answer, the officer continued. "You were driving erratically, swerving into the other lane." James frowned and calmly responded, "I wasn't swerving, sir. My dash cam can verify that." But the officer cut him off, his tone sharpening. "Dash cam, huh? That'll be confiscated for evidence." "Step out of the vehicle," the officer commanded suddenly, the escalation catching James off guard. "Is there a problem, officer?" James asked, his voice steady but filled with confusion. "I'm complying fully." The officer's jaw tightened. "I said step out of the vehicle now," he repeated, his voice laced with authority. James' stomach churned, but he obeyed, unbuckling his seatbelt and slowly opening the door. As his hands rose into clear view, the second officer quickly grabbed his arm and yanked him toward the patrol car. "Is this necessary?" James asked, his voice firm but measured. He had done nothing wrong, but the officer sneered in response. "Resisting, huh? You want to play that game?" The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into his wrists as they were secured tightly. James's mind raced. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was racial profiling. The officers had no idea who they had just arrested. As they shoved him into the back of the squad car, James glanced down the street. He saw a few neighbors peeking through their blinds, their silhouettes illuminated by the soft glow of porch lights. No one stepped outside. It was a familiar scene. But this moment wasn't over. James wasn't going to stay silent for long. The officers had no idea that the man they had just arrested was not just anyone. James Carter wasn't just a resident of Raleigh. He was the new police chief. As the squad car rumbled down the street, James Carter sat stiffly in the back seat, his wrists still aching from the tightness of the handcuffs. The fluorescent lights inside the car flickered slightly, casting an eerie glow on the interior. He glanced out the window, watching the familiar streets of Raleigh blur past him. His mind was racing, trying to process the absurdity of the situation. Here he was, James Carter, the newly appointed police chief of Raleigh, arrested for a crime he didn't commit, held in the back of a patrol car by two officers who had no idea who he was. The two officers up front continued their casual chatter, as though nothing out of the ordinary was happening. The younger one, Officer Daniels, glanced back at James through the rearview mirror. "What's your story? Late-night drug run or just like causing trouble?" His tone was laced with mockery. James met Daniels' gaze without flinching, his expression calm but resolute. "I'm just a man trying to get home," he replied, his voice even. "Oh, sure," the other officer, Reed, chimed in, snorting with laughter. "We hear that line all the time. Reckless drivers always have an excuse." James gritted his teeth but chose not to respond. Arguing now would only make things worse. He took a deep breath, focusing on staying calm. He knew his rights, but more importantly, he knew the odds. In this situation, he could already feel the weight of the system pressing against him. He wasn't just a regular citizen. He was the new face of law enforcement in Raleigh, and this was exactly the type of abuse of power he had sworn to fight against. The ride felt like it lasted an eternity, the car bumping over uneven roads as the officers continued their careless banter, seemingly oblivious to the gravity of what they were doing. They didn't know it yet, but James was about to turn this whole situation around. When they finally arrived at the precinct, the harsh buzz of fluorescent lights greeted them as they entered the holding area. The officers led James into a small holding cell, its cold, sterile walls offering no comfort. The sound of the heavy doors slamming shut behind him echoed, lingering in the air like the final note of a grim symphony. Sitting down on the hard bench, James rubbed his sore wrists. His mind raced, replaying the events of the evening like a movie in his head. He had spent years building a career dedicated to justice, fairness, and equality. Now, here he was, locked in a cage, being subjected to the very kind of abuse of power he had worked so hard to eradicate. Outside the cell, Daniels and Reed leaned against the desk, flipping through his license and registration. "Nothing out of the ordinary," Daniels muttered, sounding almost disappointed. "No warrants, no prior offenses." He tossed the papers aside as though James was just another faceless individual to be dismissed. Reed, on the other hand, seemed more determined to make something out of nothing. "Doesn't matter," he said with a smirk. "We'll find something on him. Guys like him always have skeletons in their closets." James overheard their conversation, but he didn't let their words rattle him. He remained seated, his hands clasped in front of him, his posture steady. He wasn't angry, he wasn't scared, he was calculating, waiting for the right moment to make his move. He knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The hours dragged by, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Other officers came and went, casting curious glances at the man in the cell. None of them recognized him, but James hadn't expected them to. He was new to Raleigh, having only taken the position as police chief 3 weeks ago. Most people still didn't know who he was. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to peek over the horizon, James heard the sound of footsteps approaching. The door to the holding area opened, and in walked a stern-looking officer. Lieutenant Rebecca Morgan. She was the kind of officer who commanded respect without saying a word, her presence radiating authority. As she glanced at James, her eyes narrowed slightly, but there was no judgment in her gaze, just the professionalism of someone who knew how to get to the truth. She looked at the paperwork in her hand, then back at James. "What's going on here?" she asked. Dangle stepped forward, eager to explain. "Picked him up last night for reckless driving and resisting arrest," he said, his voice casual. Morgan raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Reckless driving?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Where's the evidence?" Reed shrugged nonchalantly. "We haven't processed it yet." Morgan's eyes hardened. She turned to James. "Do you have any idea why you were stopped?" James stood up, meeting her gaze with the same calm resolve he had maintained throughout the night. "I was told it was for reckless driving, which I categorically deny," he said, his voice clear and steady. "I also have a dash cam that can verify my version of events." Morgan's expression darkened. "Get it now," she ordered Daniels before turning to Reed. "You My office, now." As the officers shuffled away, James knew that things were starting to shift. The tide was beginning to turn, but this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The battle for justice was just beginning, and James Carter wasn't going to let this go. As the minutes dragged on, James Carter sat quietly in his holding cell, his mind racing. The hours seemed to stretch on forever, each second a reminder of the absurdity of his situation. He had always been a man who prided himself on his ability to stay calm under pressure, but this was something else entirely. He was the police chief, the very person responsible for upholding justice and holding officers accountable, and yet here he was, being treated like a criminal by the very people who were supposed to protect and serve. Outside the cell, he could hear the muffled voices of officers going about their business. Some walked past his cell, casting curious glances at the man in the holding area. None of them recognized him. James hadn't expected them to. He was new to Raleigh, having only taken over as police chief 3 weeks ago. Most of the department still didn't know his face, and those who did likely wouldn't have connected him to the man sitting in the cell. But James knew this was more than just a personal insult. It was a glaring example of the systemic issues he had been trying to address from the inside. This wasn't just about him. It was about a culture of bias and abuse that had taken root within the department. And if there was one thing James had learned over the years, it was that change didn't happen by sitting quietly and waiting for it to come. He would have to fight for it. Finally, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, signaling the arrival of Lieutenant Rebecca Morgan. She was no stranger to James. He had worked with her briefly before taking on the role of chief, and she was known for her sharp instincts and no-nonsense attitude, the kind of officer who didn't let things slide, especially not something like this. Morgan approached the cell with purpose, her expression unreadable. She was holding a tablet in her hand, and without a word she gestured for James to step closer to the bars. He stood, his movements slow but deliberate, making sure to keep his hands visible. "We reviewed your dashcam footage," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I've also spoken with the arresting officers." She paused, glancing at the tablet in her hands. "Let me be clear. This should never have happened." James felt a surge of relief wash over him. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He had known all along that the footage would vindicate him, but hearing Morgan acknowledge it was a small victory in itself. She continued, "The footage contradicts their report entirely. There's no evidence of reckless driving, no justification for the arrest." James allowed himself a small nod. He had kept his composure throughout the entire ordeal, but this was the turning point. The officers who had falsely accused him were about to be exposed, and there was no way they could deny it now. "I'm meeting you immediately," Morgan added, her tone softer now but still authoritative. "But I'd like to discuss next steps privately." James didn't hesitate. He had been calm, calculating, and patient throughout the night, and now was not the time to let his guard down. He nodded in agreement, silently grateful that Morgan was on his side. But as she led him out of the holding area, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The officers who had arrested him, Daniels and Reed, would face consequences, but this incident was a reflection of a much larger issue within the department. As they walked through the precinct, James took in the busy surroundings. Officers were moving about, attending to their duties, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. Morgan led him to her office, a stark room that was simple but functional. "Take a seat," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. James sat down, his mind still racing. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. His position as police chief wasn't just a title. It was an opportunity to make real, lasting change. But he knew that change would come at a cost. As Morgan began discussing the next steps, including filing a formal report against Daniels and Reed, James couldn't help but feel a sense of resolve building within him. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the department he was now responsible for and the community that had entrusted him with the power to lead. This was a pivotal moment, a turning point in his career and in the fight for justice, and James Carter was ready to take it on. He wasn't just going to let this situation fade into the background. He was going to make sure it sparked a movement, one that would hold officers accountable and ensure that no one else would have to experience the same kind of injustice he had. As he left Morgan's office, the morning sun was starting to rise outside, casting a golden hue over Raleigh. The city was waking up, but for James, the real work was just beginning. As James Carter walked out of the precinct, the cool morning air hit him like a wave. The events of the past several hours had been a whirlwind, but there was no time to rest. He had been released from custody, his innocence proven by the dash cam footage. But what was coming next was something far more significant. He wasn't just going to let this incident fade into the background. This was the moment he would take a stand, not just for himself, but for the entire department and for the community that trusted him to lead with integrity. By the time he arrived at the courthouse, the buzz of anticipation was palpable. Word had spread quickly about the arrest of James Carter, the new police chief, and the media was already on standby. Cameras lined the courthouse steps, their lenses pointed directly at the door, eager to catch every detail of what would unfold. Reporters shouted questions at him as he walked up the steps, microphones thrust toward him in a frenzy. James knew they were eager for a story, but he wasn't ready to give them what they expected. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The judge, a seasoned man with an unyielding demeanor, had already called the session to order. James sat quietly at the defendant's table, his lawyer, Sandra Reyes, flipping through a thick folder of evidence. Sandra had been an ally from the start, sharp, determined, and unrelenting. She had fought for justice in ways most people only dreamed of, and today she would prove that James had been wrong. Across the room, Officers Daniels and Reed sat with their attorney, looking less confident than they had the night before. Daniels was fidgeting nervously, his foot tapping uncontrollably, while Reed, ever the arrogant one, leaned back in his chair, trying to appear calm. But the smugness that had once defined his demeanor had completely evaporated. The prosecution began, outlining their case against James. The story they told was one of reckless driving, resistance to arrest, and a man who simply couldn't be bothered to comply with authority. But as the prosecutor droned on, Sandra barely suppressed a smile. She knew they were walking right into her trap. When it was her turn, Sandra stood, her presence commanding the room. She didn't just speak, she owned the courtroom. "Your Honor," she began, her voice firm, "the charges against my client are not only baseless, but they also represent a much deeper issue, racial profiling and abuse of power." The room was silent. James could feel the weight of Sandra's words settling over the courtroom like a thick fog. She wasn't just defending him, she was exposing the truth, and she wasn't going to stop until it was revealed in its entirety. Sandra gestured to the bailiff who dimmed the lights in the courtroom. Then, with a click of a button, the dashcam footage was played. The room watched in complete silence as the video unfolded. There, in black and white, was the evidence of James driving calmly and within the speed limit. The patrol car's lights flashed on with no justification, the officers approaching aggressively, their words dripping with suspicion. As the footage continued, the contrast between James's calm demeanor and the officers' hostility was impossible to ignore. Gasps filled the room as the video played out. The judge's brow furrowed deeply as he glanced at the officers. The evidence was damning, and there was no way they could deny it. Sandra paused the video, letting the tension hang in the air for a moment before turning to address the court again. "This is not just an abuse of power," she said, her voice unwavering. "This is a violation of my client's rights, rooted in bias and prejudice." The prosecution stood, visibly flustered, but Sandra wasn't done yet. She cut them off before they could even form a coherent response. "Probable cause?" she asked, her tone incredulous. "Based on what? A man driving safely, following instructions? Or perhaps it was the color of his skin?" The judge slammed his gavel, calling for order, but the damage had already been done. The courtroom was in shock and the officers were on the defensive. But it was James' moment that would seal their fate. With a calm but firm voice he stood. The room fell silent as he addressed the judge. "My name is James Carter," he began, making sure to make eye contact with both Daniels and Reed, who were now looking anywhere but at him. "I am the police chief of Raleigh, appointed just 3 weeks ago. I chose not to disclose my position earlier because I wanted the truth to come out organically, without bias or interference, and now it has." The room erupted in murmurs. Daniel's face turned pale, and Reed's smug expression evaporated in an instant. The realization that they had just arrested their own boss, the very man responsible for overseeing the department, hit them like a ton of bricks. James' voice rang out, strong and unwavering. "This is not just about me," he continued. "This is about a system that allows officers like Daniels and Reed to operate without accountability. That ends now." The judge banged his gavel, calling for a brief recess. But the damage had been done. James had made his point, and the officer's fate was sealed. The charges against him were dismissed, but that wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. As James Carter walked out of the courthouse, the weight of the past 24 hours pressed heavily on his shoulders. The sunlight was bright, but it couldn't erase the sting of everything that had happened. The courtroom had erupted in murmurs when he revealed his identity as the new police chief. It had been a moment of reckoning, one that had exposed the deep flaws in the department and shown the world just how far things had gone wrong. But now, the real work began. Reporters swarmed him as he exited the courthouse, their cameras flashing and microphones shoved in his face. The questions came at him in rapid succession, each one more insistent than the last. "Chief Carter, what are you going to do now? Are you going to press charges against the officers who arrested you?" James paused for a moment, raising his hand to signal for silence. The crowd stilled, waiting for him to speak. He stood tall, his voice steady and firm. "This case isn't just about me," he began, his words ringing out clear and strong. "It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that every person, regardless of who they are, is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve." The reporters remained silent, hanging on his every word. "As a police chief, I'm committed to creating a department that values integrity and fairness. And as a citizen, I'll continue to fight for justice not just for myself, but for everyone." The words were powerful and they resonated deeply with the community. The media frenzy was far from over, but James wasn't concerned with the spotlight. This was bigger than just him. This was about the future of his department, the future of Raleigh, and the future of a system that had failed too many for too long. The spotlight might be on him now, but he knew this was just the beginning. Back at the precinct, the fallout from the case was swift. Officers Daniels and Reed were immediately suspended pending an internal investigation. Public outrage over the incident spread like wildfire, with protests erupting in the streets and calls for reform growing louder by the day. The dashcam footage, once just a piece of evidence, had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the department. It was a turning point, and James knew that the only way forward was through change. The very next day, James called an emergency meeting with his entire department. The room was tense as officers filed in, their eyes on him as he stood at the front. He could feel the weight of their gaze, but he stood tall. This wasn't just about the officers who had wronged him. This was about the future of the entire department. "What happened to me last night wasn't an isolated incident," James began, his voice cutting through the silence. "It's a symptom of a larger problem, one that we've all been a part of, whether we've acknowledged it or not." He let his words hang in the air for a moment, giving them time to sink in. "We are here to serve and protect, not to harass and intimidate," he continued, his tone resolute. "If you can't uphold those values, then this isn't the place for you. We have a responsibility to the community, and we must earn their trust every single day." The room was quiet. The gravity of his words was undeniable. For the first time, it felt like change might actually be possible. But James knew it wouldn't be easy. The work that lay ahead of him was going to be difficult, but it was necessary. In the weeks that followed, James took swift and decisive action. He implemented mandatory bias training for all officers and introduced stricter oversight measures. An anonymous reporting system was set up for officers to report misconduct, and community engagement programs were launched to rebuild the trust that had been shattered by the actions of a few bad officers. It wasn't an easy road. Trust wouldn't be rebuilt overnight, but over time, James began to see the change he had hoped for. His leadership was starting to make a difference, and the department was slowly shifting toward a culture of accountability and transparency. Months later, at a town hall meeting, a young man stood up to speak. His voice cracked slightly as he addressed the crowd. "Chief Carter, what you went through? It could have been me. It could have been any of us. Thank you for standing up not just for yourself, but for all of us." James' heart swelled with pride as he nodded. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he said, his voice steady, "but together, we can build a system that truly serves everyone." As the meeting wrapped up and people began to file out, James lingered for a moment, watching them leave with renewed hope. He knew the fight wasn't over. It would never truly be over, but he was ready for whatever came next. If there was one thing that James Carter had learned from everything that had happened, it was that change wasn't something you waited for, it was something you fought for. And he was ready to keep fighting, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been failed by the system. As the dust began to settle and the aftermath of the courtroom revelation unfolded, James Carter knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger journey. His fight for justice wasn't just about clearing his name or exposing the misconduct of a few officers. It was about shaking the foundations of a broken system and creating a department that truly served the people. He understood that trust was something that had to be earned, and though the path ahead would be long and difficult, he was prepared for the challenge. James knew that change wouldn't happen overnight. The transformation he sought in his department and the broader community would require consistent effort, courage, and the unwavering belief that justice could prevail. His journey from a police chief wrongfully detained to a leader fighting for accountability was a testament to the power of resilience and integrity. It wasn't just about holding others accountable. It was about showing the world that, when you stand up for what's right, you have the power to inspire real change. The lessons in this story are clear. First, always stand up for yourself, especially when you know the truth is on your side. Second, be patient, because change takes time, but with persistence, you can make a difference. And lastly, true leadership isn't about titles or authority. It's about taking responsibility and leading with integrity, no matter the challenges. So what can we take away from James Carter's story? It's simple. Never allow the flaws of a system to define who you are. Even when you're faced with injustice, you have the power to turn things around, to speak up, and to lead by example. Now, I'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this story and think it holds a meaningful lesson, drop a comment with the number 1. If you feel there's something more I could add to make the video even more engaging, hit comment with the number 0. Your feedback means everything to me, and I'm excited to continue sharing content that inspires change. Remember, the fight for justice never ends, so let's keep pushing for better. Together, we have the power to make a difference.